Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Clara. In today's video we're gonna be practicing sewing odd shapes, so anything that's rounded and pointy and rectangular, and I'm gonna show you what you have to do when you're sewing two layers of fabric together that have a certain shape, that you can turn the fabric to the right side and still have a nice and clean, nicely shaped edge. So let's jump right into this. I cut out these three shapes for our today's practice. Now, it might not be Christmas while you're watching this, but a Christmas tree is really great for this exercise, and so are the circle and the rectangle. So each shape consists of two layers of fabric, and I already aligned the fabric so that the right side is now inside and the wrong side is on the outside. And the first step we're gonna do is to pin the fabric, the layers of fabric together for each shape. So let's start with the circle. Now this has obviously round edges, so the best way how to pin this is to imagine as though this were a clock. So let's put one pin at 12 o'clock, at 6, and then at 3 and 9, and we can put a few in between. Doesn't have to be exactly 12. This is a small circle, so I find that 4 additional pins are gonna do the trick. And you can see that I'm pinning at an angle, which is, for me personally, the best way how to do it, because this way you can keep the pins inside of the fabric even when you are going to be sewing on your sewing machine. You still have to be careful because you don't want to hit the pins with your sewing needle. The needle might get some damage and the pin might break or the needle might break, but this is a great way how to do it. Other option would be to grab a simple white thread and go around the edges with a running stitch a little bit further from the edge than where you're gonna be sewing. That way you could pull the pins out, but that's usually some extra work. It is the right way how to do it, but who honestly does it? So next we're gonna pin together the two pieces of the rectangle. So here what I like doing is to pin here at an angle. So basically the pin goes at 45 degrees when you look at this corner, because that's 90 degrees, right? So I always pin first the edges, and I always make sure that the pin goes through this line. I made the line where I'm gonna be sewing, and I like pinning exactly through the edge of the future seam, the seam that we are going to create together on our sewing machine. So let's pin all the other edges, and then again, because this is a small rectangle, I don't need more pins necessarily, but I will put in on each edge one additional pin, just so that the fabric will be nicely aligned. So that's how I like pinning. And now let's move on to the Christmas tree. So here what I will do is I will pin first the top of the Christmas tree, and then I will put one pin into each corner a bit further from the edge. What you can do, and that's something I definitely recommend, is grabbing a sewing crayon, and you can already make a line for where you want your seam to be. And when you're pinning, then you can pin exactly into the edge. It's optional, you don't have to do it, because if you already watched the first video in this course, then you know that you can use your sewing foot as a guide. So you can simply align the sewing foot with the edge of this, and then you will have perfectly straight stitch. However, it is still a great thing, especially at the beginning, to make some kind of mark so that you have an idea where you're going to be sewing. So I do recommend it. So let's do it on one side, and I'm gonna leave it on the other side. So you see that I put the pins into each pointy end. I'm gonna do the same on this side. And then I will put pins here towards these corners. And then here, again at an angle, because these sides are a little bit longer. I don't find it necessary to pin here these corners because this is quite small. And one thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put here where the deer is, one pin on each side of the deer. And I'm gonna make a mark here that will tell me this is a section that I don't want to sew together, because I have to be also able to turn this to the right side. And that's something we have to also keep in mind on these shapes. So I'm gonna make here a mark between these two pins. I have to leave the circle somewhere open so that I'll be able to turn it to the right side. And let's say we're gonna leave here a little bit space. So just to be sure that we don't forget it, I will put in the pins like so. That's a little bit different than around each edge, and that will tell me, aha, I have to start sewing here, and then I go around and I will stop sewing here so that this remains open. I hope that this is not too fast. Another option how to mark the spots that you want to leave open so that you don't forget is to grab your scissors and make a very tiny cut on each mark, and then as you will be sewing you will notice, aha, there is a cut. There was something I had to remember. So I will make the cuts here on the outer side of the two pins, and then we will not forget, and we'll do the same here, and that way we know this is our mark. So these are several options how to mark things when you pin your pieces together. And now I will set up the sewing machine and we will sew all these pieces together. I just turned on the sewing machine. So the standard settings on my sewing machine are straight stitch, needle is completely on the left side, and the length of the stitch is automatically 2.5. I will keep this stitch length for the Christmas tree and for the rectangle because the fabric is a little bit thinner. For the denim, for the rectangle, I am going to increase the stitch to the length 3. And since I plan on sewing quite close to the edge, it's possible that I will have to move the needle. So with the straight stitch, if I want to move the needle further to the right, I have to increase this settings. So this is normally, if you remember from the course about sewing machine, for stitches like zigzag, that would increase or decrease the width. In the case of a straight stitch, it will move the needle either further to the right or back to the left. So right now I'm going to leave it like that. I am going to be working with 2 different colors of thread. So I have here some leftover brown thread that I want to use up, and this is the perfect opportunity. And for the bottom on the bobbin, I have some leftover Bordeaux red thread, and that will do for today because these things that we're going to make are going to be then turned to the right side. And for sewing on the wrong side, it doesn't matter. Let's start with the rectangle though, because this is just sewing straight before we move on to the circle and then to the Christmas tree. So we have here these 2 marks. So I want to be able to turn this piece once it has been sewn together to the right side, and for that I will need this opening. And now that I have here these 2 little cuts, I will place the needle of the sewing machine exactly here on the line where I want to be sewing, where the little cut is. So I'm gonna place the fabric into my sewing machine and I will lower the sewing foot. I will make sure that the pins are moved far away from the thread, and I will lower the needle now. And the machine is set up so that the stitch is now set to the length 3, so it's 0.5 longer than what I'm gonna use for the Christmas tree and for the rectangle. So the needle is now inside, so I'm gonna lift the sewing foot again and turn this so that I can sew straight towards this edge. And when I lower the sewing foot, you will notice that the edge of the little window of the sewing foot, which is by the way the zigzag sewing foot, is aligned with the edge of this fabric. So I will start sewing slowly. The machine is gonna do first the sew up. And now I'll sew only towards the corner of the line that I marked on the fabric. Now I will lift again the sewing foot while the needle is still lowered, because that way I will make sure that the fabric will stay in place. And once I turned this 90 degrees, I will lower the sewing foot. And I can already see that the edge of the window is a little bit too far from the edge, so I will go back and I will make one more stitch. Now I will lift the sewing foot again, turn the fabric back, and now I can see it's perfectly aligned, so I can continue sewing. Now, lift, turn. I can see that I'm again a little bit too far. One more stitch, turn. Now the edge of the little window is perfectly aligned with the edge of the fabric. I can continue. Now I'm back on the side where I have the little cuts that mark the place for the opening, so I will sew only to the second mark, and then I'll do the sew up. Let's work on the circle. So I'm gonna decrease the length of the stitch to 2.5 as it was when I turned the machine on. I will grab the circle and I will see where the marks are. So they are between these two pins. So this is where I'm gonna start sewing. Now this is a little bit more challenging because the edge is rounded. So imagine that there is always a tangent aligned with the edge of the circle, and that's how you are going to kind of align the fabric. So basically the edge, the inner edge of the window, the very right edge, is always aligned with the tangent that would accompany your circle. So that's what I do here. I will make sure that the inner right edge of the sewing foot of the little window is aligned with the edge of the fabric. I will lower the needle and I will slowly start sewing. And this is where you have to sew really slow, especially at the beginning, because you want to make sure that you will move the fabric the way you need to in order to keep the same distance from the edge. So first we'll do the sew up, and already here I have to kind of guide the fabric in a rounded way. And see, I'm kind of turning the fabric, making sure that the imaginary tangent is always aligned with the inside right edge of the window of the sewing foot. So you just have to take your time, do it rather slowly, and if you mess up, it does not matter. You can always open the stitches and start again. We are just practicing. That's why I include these videos into the course, because this is how you gain confidence, and this is how you can slowly learn it in your own pace, and you will notice that you will trust way more your abilities. We're almost at the end. Now we have reached the point where we have the second cut, so I will sew only towards the cut, and now I'll do the sew up. I also noticed that this pin is bent, so I'm gonna throw it away because that's usually a troublemaker. You don't want to keep pins that are bent, because very often they can twist then in the machine and sometimes things get caught. It can scratch the surface, and that could then as a result damage some fine fabrics, or the needle might hit it. So whenever you end up having a bent pin, away with it and grab a new one that's still straight. Now we're gonna work on the Christmas tree. So similarly to the circle, wherever the line is a little bit rounded, you have to imagine a tangent that you align with the inner corner of this window. And we have here again on the bottom cuts that mark where we have to keep the fabric open. So I aligned the edge of the sewing foot window again with the edge of the fabric. I'll lower the needle just like before. I will actually already remove this pin, and this is again a bent pin, so it has to go. And I will start slowly sewing. So first the sew up, and now we can continue towards this edge. And I like getting slower as I'm approaching the edge because I want to be sure that I don't go too far. Now I'm going to lift the sewing foot and turn the fabric so that I can align the edge of this little window again with the edge here on this side. And I already removed the pin, and we can continue sewing. You don't have to pull out the pins immediately, but I sometimes like doing it, especially when I'm sewing around odd shapes. And I just noticed I need one more stitch. And this should work. And now we can sew towards this edge. Here we are back on the bottom, so we're gonna sew again only towards our mark. Here we have our three shapes. I already removed all the pins from the Christmas tree. Now we are going to remove the pins from the circle and also from the rectangle. And then I will show you what to do before we turn these to the right side so that the shape of all three pieces would be perfect, especially the edges. Let's start again with the rectangle. So you have here these sharp edges, and here is also our seam. I'm just gonna mark it with this liner. It doesn't matter if it's gonna be stained. This is going to help you to understand what we want to do. So what you want to do here is to cut back the fabric close to the edge, but make sure you don't cut through the edge. So you have to cut the fabric back like so. If you didn't cut back the fabric here, once you would turn the shape to the right side, the edges would just not be as sharp as they are going to be now. Now, this is quite a small opening because we made a really small shape. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna spread these two pieces apart. I'm gonna put this liner in, and I'm just gonna help myself with the liner to turn this to the right side. This is something where you just have to try out a few things. That's what helps me, kind of pulling it over something pointy but not sharp. Don't use scissors because they could damage the stitches and they could also penetrate the fabric, and you wanna avoid that. But when we're gonna be shaping the edges, we will have to use something a little bit pointier than the butt of the liner because that wouldn't help us really much. You could use a piece of wooden stick if it's hard enough, and you can simply shape the edges. I sometimes do use scissors, but only for really sturdy fabrics because again, the scissors might damage the fabric. I also sometimes use a painting brush like this because again, the edge is pointier, but it's not as sharp as the edge of the scissors. So of course the edges are not like perfectly pointy because this is quite a thick fabric, but you'll see that they look actually very nicely shaped now. And now we have here this opening, so we're just gonna align everything. And what I also like doing is grabbing the fabric and rolling it kind of back and forth until the seam and the fabric are perfectly straightened. And then I will put in a pin here. I will again help myself with this little stick, and I will straighten the seam here so that when I close this, that everything is going to be nicely straight. And I'll put in 2 pins. Another option is to grab a pin and to kind of pull here to flatten the edge a little bit better, but that's what bends the pins long term. So it's not necessarily good when you're using thicker fabrics. It's not such a problem when you're working with thinner fabrics, but with thicker fabrics it could definitely bend the pins. And as I told you before, I honestly don't like using bent pins. They are little troublemakers. And here we have our rectangle. So there are 2 options. Either we leave it as flat as it is now, so we could go ahead to the sewing machine and we could sew close to the edge with a straight stitch. I would have to increase the length to at least 3.5, maybe even 4, because now it's thicker. There are now more layers of fabric around the edge. And I would simply sew around the entire rectangle, make the sew up, remove the pins, and the project would be finished. Or we will remove the pins and we will make of this tiny little pillow that can be used either for dolls or for plush animals if you have kids. So I'm going to stuff this. And now that our little doll pillow has been stuffed, it's nice and puffy, not too full, I can go ahead and close this opening with a whip stitch. If you don't know how to do whip stitch, you might want to check out the course Hand Stitching for Beginners. It's explained in the video number 8, and that is called hemming stitches. So I'm just gonna skip the step and I will put in a pin for the time being, and let's move on to the circle. Whenever making rounded stitches for things that need to be turned to the right side, you always want to cut out little triangles along the stitch. Otherwise, when you turn the piece to the right side, the line would not be neat. So the little triangles go basically very close to the seam, but again, make sure you do not cut through the seam. So I'm gonna make several. The distance is probably something around 2 inches, maybe even less, maybe like 1.5 inches. So I made marks for you so that you see what I'm gonna be doing. And now I'm gonna grab my scissors, and that's one of the things where it's really important to have scissors that are sharpened. And I'm gonna carefully cut out these the triangles, sorry. You might want to make a little bit more if it's a small circle, like in this case, just to be sure that the edge will remain clean once we turn the piece to the right side. If it's a bigger neckline, then the distance that I did originally would be sufficient. But I'm really worried that on this little circle that might be too far apart, so that's why I'm gonna go for the safe option and make more of these cuts. But again, if you're working on a neckline or something like that and the line is a little bit flatter, it will not be necessary to make that many cutouts. And now we will turn this piece to the right side. So I will put my index finger towards the other edge from the inside. I will grab the fabric and simply push with my thumb inside. I will gently turn the fabric, making sure that I'm not pulling on the edges where we have the opening so that I would not damage any stitches. And that's a shape where you will really have to play quite a lot with shaping the edge. So I will grab my painting brush and I will keep pushing against the seam and kind of move my way around the entire circle. And while I'll be pushing against the seam, I will be also at the same time kind of pulling the fabric over the painting brush. But you have to be very careful, especially if this is a thin fabric, so that you don't rip it apart. And if you cut somewhere a little bit close, too close to the seam, and if you cut it through, you might have the same problem that I have here, that you will come through with the painting brush, but that's okay. I will simply shape it so that I will push the fabric inwards and pretend I don't see it. But to be honest, if that were a piece you wanted to give someone, either you make it again, or you can turn the piece to the wrong side again and make a nice new seam a little bit closer inwards, and then you can redo your cut. And this time make sure you don't cut through any stitches. But I'm not gonna repeat that, or I'm not gonna fix this, but I just wanted to show you what can happen. I mean, I didn't plan that, but since it happened, I thought I might want to show you. So I'm just going to continue moving along the seam until I reach the other side and until the circle will be nicely smoothened. And I also like rolling the fabric back and forth, just like we did with the rectangle. And now I will start putting in pins. I'm not going to stuff this one. I'm just gonna make a seam around the edge. So in this case, I will put in a few pins at an angle. And now I will fold this inwards, and I will again keep rolling the fabric back and forth, and I will grab a pin and I will help myself with the pin to shape it so that the edge will be a little bit rounder here where the opening is, because right now it's kind of flat and it kind of destroys the line of the edge of the circle. So this is something where you have to play a little bit with the fabric, grab the pin and pull and push until you achieve the look that you are happy with. And now the circle is ready, so that when we set up the sewing machine again on my table, I can sew close to the edge with a straight stitch. And this is something you can, for example, use as a coaster for a drink. Now the Christmas tree. So this is kind of a combination of both rectangles and round shapes, because the shapes are not perfectly straight and we have all these corners. So first thing we're gonna do is to cut back all these corners. So I'm gonna mark this, and I'll be very careful this time so that I don't destroy anything like I did with the circle. We also have to make a cut here, just a straight cut towards the edge. And here, because it's rounded, we'll make one triangular cut. And we may make a cut like that also on the bottom because it's slightly rounded, and also here because it's not perfectly straight, and that should do. So let's cut all these pieces first. And now that we cut everywhere we needed, oops, I forgot one corner and one edge. So, but now we are ready to turn the Christmas tree to the right side. So in a case like this, again, I will pull my index finger through and I will start with the top of the Christmas tree. So I'm gonna kind of pull it over my thumb, and I'm gonna grab one of these pans and pull the Christmas tree to the right side over the pan, because this is quite safe. The pan has no sharp edges, and I will also use it in order to turn here everything inside, yeah, on the right side. That's what I wanted to say. Sometimes the words are just not coming. Of course, now that the Christmas tree has been turned to the right side, it looks considerably smaller. And I have here again my painting brush, and I will start pushing the pointy edges out and shaping the Christmas tree. I'll grab also this stick because it's a little bit pointier, but I will be very careful. And even though I want to stuff this Christmas tree in order to make the shape a little bit nicer, I will still make a seam along the edges, because that's gonna keep the edges a little bit flatter. So I'm gonna again roll the fabric back and forth. I will reshape what looks like it needs to be reshaped, and then I will start putting pins at an angle around the edges so that we will be ready to go back to the sewing machine, and so that we will be able to sew around the edge. We still have to leave this opening on the bottom open, so I will mark it with 2 pins so that I don't accidentally sew through it. I'm gonna move the pins a little bit angled, like so, that they won't be in my way when I'm gonna be sewing around the edges. So now I will grab these 2 pieces and we will return to our sewing machine, and we will sew around the edges with a straight stitch. We will start with the circle. So again, we're gonna imagine that there is always a tangent around the edge, and that's what we're gonna align with the inside right edge of the zigzag sewing foot, right? So I turned on the sewing machine and it jumped to the standard settings for a straight stitch. This time I increased the length, so we have length 3, and I also moved the needle further to the right. I moved the needle to the right 4 points, so it's actually quite close to the right edge. So I'm gonna align the imaginary tangent with the edge, with the right inside edge of the sewing foot. I will lower the needle and I will see if that's a good distance, and it looks good to me, so I can start sewing. This machine is again gonna do the sew up for me first. And now I will continue sewing around the edge. And just like before, because this is a round shape, I want to take my time. I'm in no hurry, and I would much rather have a neat outcome than sewing too fast and then having to remove the stitches and doing it over. And here we are. I can now remove the pins, and I have to cut back all these little chunks of thread on the right and on the wrong side, and then our circle is done. Now we will work on the Christmas tree. So we still have here this opening. So I'm going to be sewing from here around the entire edge, and I will end here so that the opening remains still free so that we can stuff the Christmas tree. So I will place accordingly the piece into the sewing machine. The settings are exactly the same. So the needle is moved 4 points to the right. The length of the stitch is now 3. I will lower the needle and I will let the machine do the sew up, and then I will sew with the straight stitch around the edge. And just like before, when I come close to the edge, at some point I will notice this is far enough. I will lift the sewing foot. I will turn the piece accordingly so that the edge will be aligned with the inner edge of the sewing foot, and then I can continue sewing. And I will already remove this pin so that it's not going to be in the way. Now what you noticed here, I was a little bit too close and the fabric was moving, so I kind of pushed on it and helped it a little bit, but very gently. Now the machine wasn't moving the fabric, so I lifted the sewing foot, I pulled the needle out and moved it a little bit more backwards, and then I lowered the sewing foot and continued sewing, and then it was no problem anymore. And here the pin is in the way, so this is where I have to lift the sewing foot, move the pin out of the way, lower the sewing foot again, go to the edge. Now let's move it like so. I will pull the pin out backwards again, and here I again had to push in a little bit with the fabric. So sometimes you do have to help the sewing machine a little bit, but always very gently. And here's the result. So I'm gonna grab more of this pillow stuffings. I'll remove the pins from the bottom and I will carefully open this, and I will start stuffing the Christmas tree. And because the Christmas tree is quite small, I will have to help myself. So again, you can use any kind of tool that works for you, usually something not necessarily sharp, but kind of pointy, and you can push the stuffings in. I find that with this shape, with the Christmas tree in this case, it's the best to fill out the sides first, and only after these have been properly filled out and shaped, I find it good to fill out the center. So here's our nice puffy Christmas tree. Now you have a few possibilities. So either you will simply hand stitch this together with a fall backstitch, for which I have also a tutorial in the course for hand stitching for beginners. It's the video number 7. So that will be one possibility, or you will simply sew through on the sewing machine. But now it's gonna be difficult to come here close to the needle with this sewing foot. So you can try to move the sewing foot back to the left side and see if you will be able to sew through even though the tree is so puffy, or you could use simply a zipper sewing foot, which allows you to move only this edge here, and you'll be able to sew closer to the puffy part. So it depends on how far you would be sewing from the edge and how much you stuffed the Christmas tree. I think I will make it work with the zigzag sewing foot, but chances are if you would be working a little bit closer to the edge that you would have to use the zipper sewing foot. So I will try my luck. The needle is completely on the left, and I put in 2 pins at an angle like so, and I will move in so that the machine will start doing the sew up here where the stitch ended, and we'll see if it works. So let's lower the needle, and now I'm gonna say a little prayer and then we can continue sewing. And it worked, so I can do the sew up and we're done with this piece. So that was our today's practice and a little fun sewing project. As I said, if you make a little pillow like this, and if you have kids, they can use the pillow for their dolls, but you can also go ahead and grab a larger piece of fabric, and if you have pillow stuffings, you can make a regular pillow for yourself because now you know how to do it. The coaster can be also made in different sizes, and you can of course also use some kind of a border around the edges to make it look a little bit fancy. And the Christmas tree would be a cute Christmas decor. I hope you guys enjoyed today's practice. Thank you all so much for watching and happy sewing!